Buck Thomas, oh my, he was the quintessential surgeon. He rode me terribly. He didn't like left-handed people in the operating room. Had been a Latin teacher before he went to med school, and was fond of playing word games with you. But he was highly respected. Spent a year in Europe, funded by an anonymous donor, and scrubbed with all the big names in Europe. Turned out the donor was actually Miss Carter, but he was terrific. Didn't think I was. Jim Ingram, one of the nicest, kindest people I ever knew. One of those few people who spent 20 years in private practice in Tampa, and but he continued publishing and coming back to Duke frequently. He was the original Buffalo, brought the Buffalo ship to Duke and started the Buffalo Society. But then after 20 years in private practice, they started the new med school in Tampa, and he was immediately made the chair and was chair for 20 years. Even though we never worked together or trained together, I got to know him well at boards and Carter meetings and so on. Carlisle Crenshaw's one of the most decent people I've ever known, certainly one of the hardest working. One of the few senior residents who would, when you were absolutely going down the drain because you couldn't get caught up with work, would drop back, roll up his sleeves and bail you out, work with you. But, oh, he was just terrific. Guy Christian was a very good friend. My relation with Don went back to when I was a sophomore undergrad student and started working in Dr. Joe Marquis' lab, and Don was getting his PhD in anatomy under Dr. Marquis. And of course that was where he went to medical school. He had one of the most sardonic, acerbic senses of humor, but was a totally good and decent person. Played a sort of a mean, intended trick on me in anatomy. Dr. Marquis told me to get my studying done that afternoon, not work in the lab, and come in that night. They needed me. Well, what they needed me and a couple of other people was to move the cadavers for the incoming medical school class from the morgue where they were hanging up like quarters of beef, put them on a gurney and take them up and place them on the dissecting tables. And at one point, Don had me place two on the elevator and get in between them, and he said, "I'll be right with you." Slammed the door, started the elevator, and halfway up turned it off. So I was in there in the total dark with two dead people I hadn't met for about 15 minutes. Al Killam, you probably know well, you know him because he was here recently and so on, came and did a lot for MFM here. Nice guy, worked hard, extremely dedicated to patients. Over here, Eleanor Easley, she was sort of the gendarme of local GYN, trained here when Dr. Thomas and Dr. Creddick and a bunch of the other faculty had to leave during World War II and go into service. Dr. Easley, who by the way was called a madam by the residents, and Violet Turner, who had trained here also, were brought on faculty, the first two women on OBGYN faculty. They stayed on faculty during the war. When the war was over and the men came back, they were told, well, the boys are back, you can leave now, which I don't think would happen now, but she was quite a lady. And I don't understand why Violet Turner's picture isn't up here. She remained in the community and did a fair amount of research and writing with Ed Hamlin. Let's see, over here, Rick Ball followed me as head of GYN specialties and made a big contribution here in updating us on urodynamics and so on. Unfortunately, he was offered a plum of a job with Eli Lilly and left. I have no comments about this character. Charlie Pete was the quintessential gentleman. He, by the way, was sort of the informal archives of both archivist of the department and the Carter Society. It for years kept a cedar chest in its office, which had all of the minutes of the Carter Society bound in leather volumes and a lot of other relevant mementos of both the early department and the Carter Society, and I've often wondered what became of that cedar chest and all its contents. Art Christakis was brought here. He'd gone to Duke undergrad, then Medical University of South Carolina, and did his residency there, and then a fellowship in genetics in Columbia, South Carolina, and came as our first geneticist in the department. Maintained very close ties, especially with medical students, and became the dean for medical education under Bill Henley. Yeah, I wish you would ask someone about Violet Turner's picture. She was an early faculty person who did and published some significant things and then went out into the community. Bill Creasman was the first, no, I guess George Wilbanks was the first official chief of GYN oncology. And I did, after several years away, Army practice, I came back here and spent a year with Bill and Roy doing oncology. And quite frankly, initially, he and I fought like hell, but became very good friends. He's made a big contribution here. Bob Breen came here from Bowling Green. Bob was on faculty at the University of Virginia and every medical school in North Carolina, plus then he became chairman of OBGYN when ECU opened, and he was quite a help here when he was needed badly. Stan Gall followed Carlisle Crenshaw as chief of maternal fetal medicine and was here, I would guess, 10 years or so. Did good work, made a big contribution, and ended up going to the University of Louisville as chair. So as you look around you, so many of these people became chairs. Creasman, Brain, Gall, Jim Ingram. So it was, it's a fairly illustrious group here. Warren Pateau, an extremely decent fellow. When we would go to my wife's home in just outside Washington, D.C., I would go in and scrub at Walter Reed and round with them and so on. And Warren followed Colonel Zimmerman as chief at Walter Reed, and he published one of the biggest series of radical surgery done through a transverse incision. But he was chief at Reed when the Vietnam War really heated up, and he had to send several of the regular Army OBGYN people to Vietnam. And he finally resigned the chiefship and said, I can't in good honor send another OBGYN to Vietnam until I've served there myself. So he resigned at Walter Reed and volunteered for Vietnam, and then later was hired as director at of our residence in Fayetteville at Cape Fear Valley. Did a marvelous job. He was a cool gentleman. Bill Herbert was, Bill followed Al Kellogg as chief of MFM here, and then of course went to the University of Virginia. John Schmidt could tell you a lot more about Bill than I, but he made a big contribution here and was a fine person. Here is one of the most interesting people I encountered, Walter Cherney. He was a resident from McGill who trained here. And he told the story about being interviewed by Dr. Carter, and Dr. Carter said, what the hell are you doing down here? I'm not sure that we want a GD Canadian with a French accent on the house staff. And Walt's rejoinder was, well, GD, I don't really care what you want, you're fart, I'm coming. And he was rose to the rank of full professor here, and then took over as director of a big hospital in Arizona, but was a fun person, an extremely bright person. Toward the end of World War II, had trained in sabotage and parachute jumping because he was so fluent in French, and he fully expected to have to parachute into Europe behind enemy lines, but the war ended. C.P. Jones was had a master's in bacteriology. He, with Dr. Carter, were really one of the pioneers in anaerobic microbiology and obstetrics and gynecology, and wrote many papers, and that was one of the things that sort of put the place on the map, was the work, Hamlet's work, and
That's okay.
Carter and Jones' work in bacteriology and infectious disease. Thomas and Carter and Roy Parker's work in surgery. I don't know if you know or not, but Duke opened as one of a little over 100 medical schools in the U.S. and in less than 5 years was ranked in the top 20, because the whole for practical purposes, they imported the whole faculty from Hopkins. There were a few exceptions. Dr. Thomas came with Dr. Carter from the University of Virginia, where he was the acting chair at the time. Dr. Carter was. And Buck Thomas was a resident, so he came here, and Dr. Carter, he was Dr. Carter's first chief resident here. Dr. Hamlin came from the University of Virginia, and he was fond of saying that, of course, everyone else being, or so many at Duke being from Hopkins, Dr. Hamlin was fond of saying the three most overrated institutions in the United States are sex, strawberry shortcake, and the Johns Hopkins. So that's about it. Any questions?